I can. So I'm Julie Steele. I wear a lot of different hats, and I was asked to come talk a little bit about data visualization and the work that I do about that, some of the other work that I do in technology. So here's one thing that I do, except I'm not really in forensics, so here's something else that I do. Here's probably the best thing that I do. And what I'm trying to say here is that I match patterns, and I think in metaphors, and that's what my job is about. And then I tell stories about the patterns that I find. But here's what I know about stories. If a story is not about the hearer, he will not listen.
Is that different for women?
Or she. We could put an S slash. Steinbeck was from a very particular era, let's say that. I had to think hard about what I wanted to say to you guys today, because even though I've been asked to tell you a bit of my story, it has to be about you in order for you to listen, and I know that. So here's why it's about you. We are all pattern matchers, because whether or not you can see a pattern in this picture makes a difference between whether or not you're lunch. Okay, so we all match patterns, we all tell stories about them, because that's what humans have done for millennia. So what do I really do? I work for a company called O'Reilly Media, and we produce books and conferences about technology. And before that, I worked for a company called LexisNexis, editing books on commercial law and bankruptcy law. Before that, I was an editor at Exceptional Parent magazine, which serves the special needs and disabilities community. And I have a degree in political science, international relations. I also have a degree in English literature, and I like to design things. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say to you is I am a generalist. And I say this with an air of confession, because for a long time I've been really insecure about my status as a generalist. I have long worked with and studied with and been surrounded by specialists. These were programmers and lawyers and doctors and politicians and writers and artists and designers. And I've admired and envied these specialists. And I've worried that I didn't fit and that I might suffer from what I call the shampoo plus conditioner problem, which is when you're trying to do too many things at once, you don't do any of them very well. So I was trying to think, from this sort of standpoint of insecurity as a journalist, what I could come here and say to you. And I thought, well, I should stop thinking about me for a while and start thinking about them. So I went online and read a bit about your program here, and I found this. I don't know how many of you have come across this and read this yet, or how much of a theme this is here in your program, but I have to say I was greatly relieved to come across this and to find out, okay, we're all generalists here. We could be a generalist support group. We have permission to be that. And here's the other thing I took comfort from. Essentially, in the end, we're all screwed, right, or something. So, okay, I'm going to embrace my generalist status and talk to you a little bit about data visualization, since that's one of my topics of passion. So, first of all, what do I mean by data visualization? Let's get that out of the way. I'm going to define it here as the representation of a large quantity of information in graphic form, often aided by computer algorithms. Why do I have to mention that it's often aided by computer algorithms? Well, because there's this other term out there, right, infographics, and people often exchange these two terms or use them interchangeably, rather. And infographics are a similar but slightly different thing. They are also the use of graphical forms to convey information. They tend to be lower quantity of information at a time, and they tend to be higher touch in terms of manual design. So they tend to be one-offs instead of algorithmic. So it's a fine distinction, a subtle one perhaps, but I find it useful. And the other thing to know about both data visualization and infographics is that they're really a method of communication. Communication needs to be a two-way street, by which I mean what you're doing is taking information from point A and coding it, and then it's reaching point B where it needs to be decoded at the other end. So there's this thing I've come to call visual art, where people make graphic images based on information or based on data, but you can't decode them at the other end. This may not be showing up as well with the bright lights, but this is essentially a giant hairball. which was created by feeding somebody's delicious bookmarks through a Python visualization script, and this was the result. And it's great and it's really interesting, but there's no way you're going to get somebody's delicious bookmarks out of this. You can't decode this on the other end. It's art, and that's great and has its own value, but it's not communication in the sense that I mean it here. So, okay, data visualization. This is what I'm talking about. How did I end up involved in this? Well, as I mentioned, I work for this company, and I've been there a little over 5 years, and I started off editing books. Here are some of the books that I edited while I worked for them. And they span a broad range of topics, but actually there was a pretty clear path for me from books I was doing about the Python programming language through material on natural language processing into other aspects of machine learning and data analysis until I was pretty squarely in the camp of what we now call data science. We can debate the term data science after class if you like. But a few years ago, O'Reilly saw this as sort of an emergent field, even though, yes, it's been around for a long time. And they decided to begin a new conference about this discipline. We call it Strata. And it started in California in early 2011, but it's grown to the point where we're doing 4 of them a year now. And in early 2012, I was pulled over from the editorial side to work on Strata full time. And I became sort of immersed in this community that's obsessed with all things related to data. Meanwhile, I was this kid from the suburbs who grew up watching Bob Ross, like I'm sure many of you. I grew up with him. He was amazing and comforting, and he created entire worlds right before my eyes. And I got some paints and some canvas, and I spent hours in my room trying to cut in mountains and tap in happy little trees. And I was also spending time with my mother, who has decades of experience doing graphic design and desktop publishing. And she was doing some of this on a volunteer basis for various church groups she was involved in. And when I was 15, I started playing around with the graphics and the shapes myself, and I got really, for some reason, I became really enamored of this little repeating motif along the top and bottom of here, which has this little heart shape, which is the negative space in between 2 kind of feminine figures. So I designed this cookbook cover for one of the women's groups that she worked with. And later that year, I turned that same motif into a logo for a group in which experienced mothers kind of share insights and encouragement with younger mothers called Mom to Mom. And they paid me for it. This was the first logo I ever sold, and come to think of it, it might be the last one I got paid for. But I kept going because this was amazing to me that you could take this thing, this visual communication method, play around with it, hand it over to someone, and they found it valuable. They wanted to pay me for it. And I thought, I might be onto something. And I proceeded to do it for free, which was mistake number 1. But I loved it. And so over the years, I've continued to do design work, mostly on a volunteer basis, mostly on paper. This is a brochure I designed for a choral group a few years ago. And all of that on the side kind of led me to this guy. And when I got here, through my love of visual communication, I thought, this is amazing. This is the intersection of these 2 things that I love and that I'm steeped in, but these books are really dense. So how can I share these ideas with the audience that I have at O'Reilly, these programmers, in ways that feel more like the stories I'm used to telling? And so I did this book. This is a collection of 20 chapters by some of the leading data visualization experts. And I invited Noah Iliansky, whose background was more on the data side, to be a contributing editor along with me. And it was really well received. And so after that, we thought, wait a second, there's actually another book to be written here. We need to explain the basics of how to do this stuff. Because the audience that we had, as I say, were mostly programmers, statisticians, people used to doing analysis. And the more I talked to those people, the more I realized they think this stuff is a bunch of airy-fairy, creative mumbo-jumbo that they don't have the skills to embark on, right? They think this is unicorns and rainbows, and as soon as you say design, you're talking about something they can't do. And the truth is, data visualization is a process. It does require a lot of creativity and outside-the-box thinking, and the more background you have in visual language, the better you're going to do, but a lot of it is simply a step-by-step process of questions you need to ask and decisions you need to make, and taking that information from point A, encoding it, bringing it to point B, decoding it, And those are concepts that programmers are quite comfortable with. So we wrote that book. And it attempts to lead a particular audience down this initial path. And we feel like we did a good job with that. I'll just add as a footnote, because I think it's useful. I have a third invisible baby. This is a book that I did, Beautiful Data Before, Beautiful Visualization. Similarly, it's a book of 20 contributed chapters. The only reason I'm not listed as an editor on this book is because I didn't know I could ask to be listed on the cover until I did the second one. So note to self, always ask if you can be credited for the work that you've done. I feel like I have three babies and one got lost in the wilderness. Anyway. So as the books got out there, people started inviting me to come speak about data visualization, and I've done that. But I have to tell you, actually, this has been a sort of thing that I've wrestled with, because as a generalist and not a specialist, I'm able to pick out patterns and I'm able to see trends, but I'm not actually putting my own work out there as much as a lot of other people are. And one of the things I've wrestled with is asking, am I allowed to critique? Am I allowed to synergize? Am I allowed to comment when I'm not taking those same risks and same vulnerabilities that a lot of people are who are out there putting out work every day? If they saw that cookbook from 1997, I'm sure there'd be a lot of commentary. So that's a question I continue to wrestle with, and that's something interesting. But I ultimately decided that even though I don't know as much as some specialists, I still know more than other people, and I can share what I do know and try to raise that community level conversation. And that's where I've come out on that. But please let me know if you have thoughts. As I was thinking more about data and representing it visually, I was writing about it and talking about it, and Strata was growing. So one of the things I decided to do was create a series of gallery exhibits called the Data Visualization Showcase. I wanted to show people all the different kinds of work that are out there, and I wanted them to think beyond sort of bar charts and line graphs, or at least to see some really beautiful bar charts and line graphs. And so I've put this together and I've curated it. And it has been so rewarding to watch people come and really be into this stuff. And it does speak to them. And it does communicate information in a way that only visual representation can. Why is that? Like, what does visualization do? Why, if you have data to communicate, is visualization a good encoding method? So I'll just take a quick detour. How many people are familiar with Combs Quartet? Have you guys seen this? Okay. This is 4 sets of data points that all have the same statistical average. So what that means essentially is that mathematically they're all identical. But as soon as you plot them, you can see they're actually really different. So why data visualization? Because we gain insight. We have that aha moment. And we have it very quickly in ways that we couldn't get to with math alone. And I also like to differentiate between 2 types of data visualization. Say we have the moon. The moon represents our data. We can go there and kind of get up close and personal and explore it and look around. And there's all this like level of granularity, all this peaks and valleys and pebbles. And there's this exploring kind of data visualization where you don't yet know what it might hold. It can also be a double check on your collection methods, just looking for outliers or unexpected values. It doesn't have to be elegant. And then the second kind is this explaining kind of visualization. It's a little bit more complicated because if visual exploration is communication between like you and the data, trying to figure out what the data is telling you, then visual explanation requires communication between you and other people. So this is the method you use to present your findings to other people. And this is where a lot of careful editing can really go a long way and where refinement counts, because as Jessica Hagee points out, there's a sweet spot where you have to have the right level and the right kind of information, or otherwise, if you don't provide enough, there's no context and you'll cause confusion. If you provide too much, you'll overwhelm people. So identifying the key structural elements that need to be highlighted and paring everything else away so that the essentials can shine, that's often the hardest part. But we have another word for this. It's called editing. And let's just say I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to present information in a clear, well-structured way in other forms of communication. So there's also the matter of what Noah and I have come to call the source trinity. And this is the idea that there are three sources that need to all inform the decisions that you're making about data visualization. First, there's the designer. Let's say that's you. Then there's the reader, and that's not you. And that seems pretty obvious, but a lot of people forget that the reader shows up with all kinds of context of their own, right? And assumptions and conventions that may be totally foreign. And you need to work with and not against these preconceptions. You need to remember Steinbeck, right? If a story is not about the hearer, he or she will not listen. Finally, there's the data and the story that it has to tell and the information that it has to communicate. And you need to find sort of the nexus of these three things coming together and what they all have to contribute. And once you do, it's time to start communicating. We can do this with, I like to think of I've already talked about how this is a language or an encoding mechanism. We can do this with a set of visual primitives. There's an excellent paper called Rules and Principles of Scientific Data Visualization by Hikmet Senay and Eve Ignatius. It was written in 1994, and it spells out these visual primitives. You can think of these things, lines, dots, and other marks, as words that you can string into sentences that can be modified to fit your meaning. So there's three kinds of these visual primitives according to Senay and Ignatius. One is positional or spatial, and this is where you have things placed on the page. And I know I don't have to talk to you guys about Gestalt principles or anything like that. So positioning and spatial characteristics, these are one kind of visual primitives. Another is retinal, right? The color and the size and the shape of things. And finally is temporal. So you can use time as another dimension to help communicate and to speak visually. This idea of data visualization as a language is starting to spread in interesting ways. I've been talking about it as a way to communicate with the human visual cortex and other people, but the folks at Trifacta have been working on Vega, which is this visualization grammar that lets machines talk about data visualization. And that's kind of interesting to me. I don't know if any of you have played around with this at all. But that brings me to sort of current trends and the future of the discipline. So what is that about? Well, that's easy. That's one word. Mashup, like everything else, right? So we've got data viz. It has a lot of forms. We can talk about some of those if you like. But I wanted to talk to you about some of the interesting things that are coming down the pike. The Alisphere at UC Santa Barbara is run by Dr. Joanne Kachara-Morin. It's a 3-story high sphere, and it provides this sort of immersive visualization, but also sonification experience. So you can walk out on this bridge in the middle of it, and right in this photo there's just one screen turned on, but you can turn on all the screens and be fully surrounded by visualization as well as sonification. So they do a lot of neurological research there and some other kinds of medical research, and they're often down on the atomical or molecular scale, fully immersed in the visualization and also hearing data represented as noise. Another kind of mashup that's coming soon is haptic feedback with visual feedback. So this is a figure from one of Apple's patents on haptic screen technology. But screens that provide tactile feedback as well as visual input are going to change the way information is communicated and interacted with for sure. And another thing that's coming soon is glass. And so this and other heads-up displays will create new ways to mash up visualization with the entire perceived world, right? The thing about mashups, who has the necessary breadth of knowledge to excel at mashups? Yeah, generalists. So this puts us all in a really great position. But the thing is, this stuff, it turns out, is really hard. Some people make it look really easy. This is a map of commercial airline traffic from Aaron Coblin. It's gorgeous. It's simple. It's elegant. Other maps that are changing the way people think about data visualization. These are a couple of different election maps from the New York Times. Publications like The Times and The Guardian have invested heavily in some really talented teams, and they're doing some really cool data visualization work. Their interactive election maps have been especially popular and have brought these sort of sophisticated tools and techniques to the attention of the public, but news also has some challenges. Even something as simple as color, right, can be a challenge. Turns out they've used the same color values of blue and red, and in black and white, you can't see it. Even when you have full color at your disposal, choosing the right ones can be hard. About 8 to 10% of the population can't actually read this map. There may be people in this room who can't read it. So something as basic as color, sometimes just choosing the right format is hard, right? Like even though this is a representation of healthcare costs by state, putting it on a map just doesn't help anybody, especially when the map is tilted in this funny way and it looks like New England is being abducted by aliens and I don't even know what's going on. But like just making the decision, okay, this is geographic information, but it doesn't actually need to be represented geographically. If they just gotten to that first, they would have saved themselves a whole slew of bad decisions that came later. And we all know not to compare apples and oranges, but what about comparing non-zeroed slopes? If you look at the y-axes on these two graphs, you'll see that one starts at 0 and the other doesn't. Economist Paul Krugman was discussing a government surge in spending a few years ago and whether or not it exists. And he had this graph of government spending as a percentage of GDP with this really steep upward slope. And he tried to compare it to the raw number of dollars the government has spent in billions. And he said, look, it's actually a really shallow slope. Turns out you're not comparing the same things. So even really sophisticated and educated people can get these things wrong. It's harder than it looks. Sometimes you have to wonder if these choices are intentional or not, right? I don't think Steve Jobs ever did anything unintentionally. This is a really insidious graph of smartphone market share. If you actually just read the numbers and then look and tell me, is that purple slice bigger or that green slice bigger? He's kind of taken this pie chart, which is questionable to begin with, and then tilted it backwards so that you get this weird foreshortening effect, and it tricks your eye. Was that on purpose or not? And then you get abominations like this. Some of you may have seen this going around again a couple of years ago. This was developed by the Joint Economic Committee Minority. It was an organization chart displaying this like bewildering array of new government agencies, regulations, and mandates that were. This is supposed to represent the healthcare plan known as Obamacare, and they posted it with this blog title, "America's New Healthcare System Revealed." I don't know what this reveals, except that the system is complicated. There's an independent designer out in California named Robert Palmer who took it upon himself to redesign the same system map. And this is what he came up with. So this is the same healthcare plan, and there's no doubt that it's a complex matter, right? This is not, it's certainly simpler than the last one we saw, but it's still not what I would call simple. So we can see it's complex, but this rendition clearly aims to pare down the complexity to its essential nature for the purpose of making things easier to understand, which is the goal of communication, right? Rather than purposefully obfuscating what's happening. So these are some of the challenges that we have in data visualization, right? Even the simple things like choosing color or choosing structure can be hard. And then when you're really dealing with complex information, trying to choose how to represent it in a way that's clear and not obstructionist can be hard. And then you have to confront things like the tools, right? The tools don't make things any easier. This is actually PowerPoint's default data. When you ask it for a graph, it just sort of plops that onto your screen. And there's nothing wrong with Excel or with PowerPoint. They're actually pretty robust and useful tools. The problem is all the defaults are wrong, really, really wrong. And that can be an obstruction to people. One of the things in that same paper that I was showing you earlier was talking about how in design, as in so many other areas, the tools are making things, they're lowering the barrier to entry, right? They're making things easier for amateurs to do, and there may or may not be a requisite skill level that comes with that. So it's not the fault of the tools, but if we want to have an elevated conversation, we need to think about the defaults, because defaults are powerful. And in data viz, there's another one. Tableau is a very powerful tool. It lowers the bar to entry in wonderful ways, but then you can end up with these pie graphs on a map. I can't. So we have these challenges in data visualization when it comes to raising the bar and achieving real open communication, right? And teaching others around us to use it well and responsibly is part of what we need to do. And I think this is part of the solution. Someone once told me that when bank tellers get trained, they learn to detect counterfeit bills not by looking at different kinds of forgeries, but by spending time with real currency. And once you know what a banknote really looks like and feels like and smells like, then anything substandard stands out. And I'm not suggesting that there's such a thing as counterfeit data visualization, but I'm saying that putting elegant and inspiring work in front of people can help to raise their awareness of what's possible and can help to elevate the conversation. And so this has been part of my mission and part of what I've been working to do. And not to rub my nose too far into it, but I love this. So let's go to the end. That design has the capacity to invite, to motivate, engage, entertain, delight people, moving them to action, inspiring them to believe that something better is possible. And I absolutely agree with this. And do you know who else did this? Because that's the thing, we all start somewhere, right? And so if I'm going to leave you with anything today, this is really what I wanted to say, is that you should find a spark of what grabs you and what sticks, and learn its language and learn what it has to say to you, and then speak that to others. Because we all have stories to tell, and I'm dying to hear yours. So thanks. We have about half the time left, and I really wanted to just know if you guys had any questions or if there were any things that you wanted to discuss. I'd love to hear what you're working on, and I'd also love to hear your experiences as consumers of data visualization, and ways that you've started to think about it or not think about it. So does that spark any thoughts? Yeah.
Do you think part of the reason you're a generalist and that there's a need for generalists is because there are fields like the one we're in that are so emerging and new that they haven't had time to have specialties yet?
I'm wrestling with whether to accept your premise that this field is emerging and new. No, I guess would then be my answer. I think that what we're doing is reinventing. I think that the tools and technologies and the platforms that we're all using are leveling the playing field in interesting ways, and it's causing us to have to reinvent different professions, and or ourselves. I think that as we do that, new specialties will emerge, perhaps, but they're the same as the old specialties. I mean, take publishing, which is a field I'm really familiar with. People can self-publish. They don't need the gatekeeper that was the traditional big publisher anymore. But if you look at what's out there, they still need editors, right, to help be these sort of idea midwives, as I like to think about it. And they still need, at the end of the day, curators, that C word that some people are allergic to, but curators to kind of filter through all the things that are out there. And that used to be done, before things saw the light of day. Now that's done afterwards, because if you go to the self-publishing section on Amazon, it's huge and immense, and how can you find anything? So I think everything old is new again in that sense, that, those same functions have to be performed. Maybe they're being performed at a different part of the process or in new ways or with new tools. But I don't really think that much has changed. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I had occasion to work with some statisticians
Mm.
and have asked, as a designer, have asked them, like, okay, what are tell me why you decided that this needed to be a bar graph or this needed to be a line graph, or what's your rationale, like, behind, like, why are you presenting this? And it's so specific. And I was like, could you give me a primer? Like, I want to be able to teach my staff. I want myself to understand why. And I could never get them to, like, respond. Like, it's like, well, that's the way we do it.
Right.
So it's like, so I've read a couple things. I've read a book, Naked Statistics, which was a little bit guiding in that. But I was wondering if you have any, like, either resources or tips, and I've read Tufte's too, so, like,
Yeah.
I'm doing my best on my end, but like, to get through and break through to that other discipline is
Yes.
very difficult.
I certainly sympathize. I've actually, for various reasons, spent quite a lot of time with astronomers and other people in various sciences, and they have very particular ways that they do graphs, and most of them are terrible. Like, they do this thing with double y-axes where they've got one on the left and one on the right representing different scales, and then they're basically comparing things that you can't, they're comparing apples and oranges, on the same graph. That's not a recommended practice. They'll also, they have these pieces of software that are ingrained in the industry that have terrible default settings, but if you try to show them a different approach, a lot of people will say, yes, that's very nice, it looks better, but this is the way we do things. Thank you very much. So I don't think you're alone in that, and I think it's a culture change issue that we're going to have to fight with different tactics. There are plenty of resources. I'm terrible with titles, but off the top of my head, Ronnie Lipton has a wonderful book. And there are, I'm totally blanking on his name, Steven someone. So there's a couple of great books on principles of cognitive perception and sort of the language of visual communication that I would recommend, and I'd be happy to send a list around afterwards. Sure. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Could you talk a little bit about real-time data and kind of how that's being visualized? I know there are a few, like the wind map and some amazing visualizations of kind of transactional financial data and social media. Is that a trend, do you think, that's emerging?
Yes. So again, not to be super pedantic, but you have to specify what you mean by real time, because like in finance, you might be talking the level of microseconds, right? And with wind, maybe every 5 minutes is fine, right? So what real time means, and therefore what tools you have to use to accommodate it, really varies from field to field. There's also this idea of sort of consistency and how your data flows through the system. Do you actually need it to be really accurate 100% of the time? If it's off by 10%, is that okay? We have this idea we call eventual consistency, which means that as the data is gathered in like 500 different places and filters through to the database, it may not match at any given point in time as different machines are writing to the database. They may overwrite each other, but they're eventually consistent. They kind of eventually will fill in all the gaps and get there. So not to go crazy with technical terms, but simply using the term real-time data visualization, there's like a bunch of different little parameters in there. But is it a trend? Yes. And as I was saying, like with some of those heads-up displays, Google Glass, I think you'll see more and more of that where data visualization will be done on the fly to reflect changing circumstances around us. Part of that is sometimes called just-in-time data visualization. I think I just completely lost my train of thought. But yeah, I think it'll become increasingly important, and I think we'll develop better tools for doing it. But what it means and how it affects us, I think, are yet to be determined.
I was going to ask as a follow-up, in the context of social change and social
Absolutely. Yeah.
New, I guess.
Yeah, so there's things like we can point to it with the Arab Spring, right, where Bitly actually knew there was a revolution happening before CNN did or whatever, because they were watching the links that people were sharing on Twitter, and so they were able to see like, whoa, there are some things happening here, because they were doing some of those graphs in real time or near real time, depending on your definition, and they were able to detect a signal there before the traditional news outlets. And similarly, I think a couple of years ago, Google Trends, when that was still a tool, was able to detect, what was it, bird flu or SARS or something. There was some flu trend they were able to detect before the CDC because they were watching people's search terms. So there are these interesting streams of data that if you're paying attention to can give you clues about things you didn't necessarily anticipate. And so doing that in real time gives you the edge on certain things. Yeah.
Do you ever, this goes back to the question of generalism versus specificity.
Yeah.
Do you ever wish that you could create these amazing, like do you ever, or do you wish that you could create the world's best data visualization? And sort of follow to that is, how difficult is it for somebody to learn how to use the softwares or the programs or write their own programs, or how does that sort of...
I personally do not create the world's best visualization. I do wish I could. Here's the thing, I think most of them are done in teams. And that's the secret, is that you really do, I think the ones that are extremely successful, and certainly there are people who are just extremely talented, have been doing this for a very long time, and can come up with amazing things on their own. So it's not impossible. But by and large, the most interesting things I've seen have been things that come out of teams where you've got at least 3 or 4 people that have various skill sets, various backgrounds, various kinds of domain expertise that they can bring to bear, as well as the programming chops. Because the tools are getting better and lowering the bar to entry, as I was saying, but in a lot of cases, having the idea and being able to execute on it are 2 different skill sets still. And so that's why I think the teamwork approach, it has been the winning approach so far, but not always.
I know I've downloaded several of like that you mentioned, like the Tableau and different things, and I'm just like, how do I use this? So
Yeah, and Tableau and Excel, and similar to like, I remember when I started using Microsoft Word, and I had been using like HyperCard before that or whatever, and then I had also been using InDesign. And Word is like this thing, this like hybrid that sits in the middle, where it's not quite powerful enough to be like a full-fledged design program, but it's more powerful than your average word processor or whatever. And so I feel like Tableau and to some extent Excel sit in that same area, where they're pretty powerful and they're perfect as long as you want to do exactly one of the 20 pre-prescribed things that they, right? The minute you want to do something outside of the box, you do have to have some custom knowledge of. Learning JavaScript is the best thing that I can advise for the next 5 years anyway. No guarantees after that. Or processing. Yeah.
About GIS, I'm thinking for my thesis direction, I'll be working on urban food systems, and there's a lot of data that exists within city governments and things.
Yes.
And I don't know any GIS, but I know it's a sort of data coming together with visualization for insight and explanation. Do you have experience with it, or?
I'm actually not as closely familiar with that as I am with some other areas, so I would be hesitant to give you advice on that one way or the other. But I would say big thumbs up to like municipal data and to local data sources. That's one of the most reliable places to get information. And I feel like, having watched a lot of levels of government go through this process of trying to make data open and available, certainly local municipal governments are getting there way ahead of state or federal governments. So that's a good way to go. Although your mileage may vary in the sense that some of them may get there faster than others. So your coverage may be spotty. Yeah.
just ask another question.
Go for it.
I mean, so in terms of like learning JavaScript, like
Yeah.
is that hard? I mean, like what I mean, because again, it goes to like the generalist. Like, you know, I come from an engineering background, and I have like, you know, I've done some GIS and I've done like some programming and stuff, but nothing to the point of mastery.
Yeah.
And like,
That's such a good question. It's only you can answer that. Is it worth it? But it will give you a lot of flexibility. It will give you a lot of transferable, like, even if JavaScript is not the thing forever, if you get those ideas, and I mean, it sounds like you have some programming experience already that you may be able to transfer, but here's the thing, like, is learning Chinese worth it? Is that hard? Yeah. But no, it's not. It's a worthwhile question, but it's just hard to answer because it's, I think, very subjective. Here's the thing I will tell you is that there are a lot of really cool tools out there to help people learn in different ways. It used to be that all you could do was buy one of those books and you had to read it and teach yourself. Now there are things like Khan Academy and like different sandbox tools. There's Code Academy. There's all these different ways of learning. There are plenty of meetup groups that will teach themselves. And so if you do decide it's worth it to learn, there are more tools than there have ever been to help you do it in whatever way works best for you. So. Anything else? I'm curious for all of you, like, how much of this feels new? How much of it feels like familiar territory, either because of other design work that you've done or just your experience as a consumer in, data journalism is this whole thing that we've come to hear as a term. How much of this feels like foreign territory still, and how much feels familiar?
I think you see, at least on a personal level, you see infographics and data visualization if you sort of spend time looking at certain websites, or understanding how it actually works and gets developed is the part that I think is a little bit big to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like an infographic, I think you could sort of see there are some numbers. Somebody could have probably read an article and written an infographic that pulls out some various percentages and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But data visualization and the way that you framed it and its difference from infographics, it's like just seeing the stuff that Hans Rosling does or something like that, you don't actually really get a feeling for what it takes to build something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and you start going into the interdisciplinary teams piece, but other than seeing the output, it's not something that I know almost nothing about, like, what it takes to actually go in and do that. I guess we had some people here, data kind too. Like, that's what they do.
Yes.
But if you haven't been in a place where you're surrounded by computer scientists and you've never been involved in computer science yourself, it's kind of hard to know even like what those conversations sound like.
That's really good to hear. Yeah.
About the teams that you mentioned before.
Yeah.
They are all designers, or how the teams come together?
It can vary. A lot of it is fellow generalists. A lot of it is people who've learned programming in one form or another. Maybe not all of them, but at least 2 members of the team probably have programming experience. I'd say at this point in time, that's the more common thing, is people who come from the engineering and programming side and have sort of picked up the design along the way. And I would love to see like more designers going out into the world, willing to jump in on stuff like that and say, actually, because I feel like people with design backgrounds could save a lot of the running around to get to that. But so I guess that's part of what I was asking when I was asking about your experience with some of this, is I'm curious, like, if I like showed you, where's that Steve Jobs one, like if you saw this, does your designer brain automatically go to like, oh, that's foreshortening, and that's like use of color differentiation where the purple kind of blends into the pink next to it and makes that look different? Or like, does your designer brain click in, or do you kind of approach this as a typical consumer? What's your experience with some of that?
There's always a visual hierarchy that you're used to seeing, and when you're working with color and charts, it's like, I'm very aware of it. I've also noted that when I try to do projects where I'm oftentimes given a script,
Mm-hmm.
a text, and said, okay, make graphics out of that. So then you're like sitting there pulling information out of the text to find out what could shape into something. And then, of course, you're asking the next question. Well, I can figure this out, but I don't have this other piece of data.
Right.
So then you're running to try to find that data. And I've done some things before where it's like, it's just very difficult to go back and get data at times when you don't, like when you're at the end, And even when you've got a client or an organization that has the data available, they don't often have it apples to apples. Or like
Right.
one part is missing this year and this part is missing that year. And then and then I always feel like I'm not a scientist. Like I can't, like I can tell you visually how this is going to look better.
Yeah.
But I worry about, am I representing it properly? And I can only rely on, the editors and the people, the clients to say, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think there's a big conversation around that because every choice we make as a designer can skew the information in a way.
Yes. Yeah.
This one's tough to tell also because it's a photo. It's
Yeah.
hard to tell actually that it's almost isometric or that there's supposed to be perspective on that pie chart other than that like little bit of shine around it to show you that.
Yeah, it's actually not showing up too well on the projector, but if you look at it on the screen, there's a very clear like bottom perspective thing happening. I wish I had a better photo of it. But yeah, no, what you were saying is a good point, and I would say to your point about having to run around at the end and collect additional information, a lot of that can be helped by asking in data visualization as well as other kinds of data analysis, your answer is only as good as your question, right? So a lot of that can be helped by asking a really solid question, and just editing the question at the beginning and punching holes in that will save you a lot of time and work later on. So some characteristics of a good question is it tells you what you need to know to have an answer to it, but what it does not tell you is how you're going to structure or represent that answer. So show the sales earnings is a bad question because it's too open-ended. But like, show the sales earnings per quarter in each region is a lot better. Show the sales earnings per quarter in each region on a bar chart is a bad question, right? Because it's too prescriptive. So hitting that sweet spot of making sure you understand all your parameters so that you can go get the data you need, but not over specifying so that you constrain yourself prematurely. And asking good questions is hard. I feel like humanities majors are best prepared. People who've written a lot of research papers get really good at asking great questions. Engineers tend to have to learn that later. But that's if you want to, in addition to JavaScript, if you want to be really good at data visualization, learn how to ask great questions. Any other thoughts?
Wish I could do this. Like honestly, I mean, I have perpetually these like 20 internet tabs open at different like data visualization things. They're just like the coolest thing ever. It's so. Why didn't I think of that? Like how do you think like a data visualization person like?
So I guess what I'm intrigued by is like what catches you about that, or are you able to articulate why you're so struck?
I just love data. I love information, and I love stuff that looks pretty.
Mm-hmm.
So the combination of that it's something that's graphically engaging, visually appealing, but also intense, like rich and conveying like some sort of intense data, like conveying information, like a massive quantity of data in such effective, sparse language. So you're not just looking at spreadsheets and going through like 30,000 tabs, but you're seeing like the network of Twitter users in like this 1 hour period from something, or like book themes from the Amazon top sellers at some point in certain months. But yeah, it's just I don't know, it's just so cool.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I have the same feeling that you do, and for me, it's that elegance, it's that brevity, and that sort of succinct ability to take in a lot at once. And I think that's what's so special about the visual medium is that our visual cortexes do process a lot more than our sort of linguistic, But you have to be very careful about that because it's easy to sort of be impressed by shiny, right? Like the hour's worth of tweets or whatever, and those network graphs. I feel like there are so many of those out there, and I'm hard pressed, and maybe it's just me, but I'm hard pressed to actually get a lot out of those other than like one or two. So there's a lot of data viz out there that I feel a little conflicted about because I feel like on the one hand, it looks beautiful and it can draw people in, and if it makes people curious and if it makes people engaged, those are great things to accomplish. On the other hand, I'm not sure that all of those things necessarily achieve that sort of eloquence or succinctness, and I would love to push towards more of that. I had a couple of writing professors that used to say to me, independently of each other, I don't know where there must be like a writing professor class where they tell your students this. Why this word in this place, they would all say to me. Like each word has to have a purpose. And in visual communication, it's why this line or why this, and Tufte talks about what he calls chart junk, which is just this extra clutter that's on there to look impressive, but doesn't actually communicate much. So why this word or why this line or why this dot in this place? And so to me, the power, the thing that like lights up that light bulb for me about data viz is when I say like everything here has a purpose and I can take it all in, and that's like the holy grail, right? And people spend decades and decades trying to get there, but that lesson, like that discipline, that practice is really enticing. Any other thoughts? Thank you very much.